Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us for a very special session of our Communist Culture Club. It's about sports, a bit unusual subject for us to cover, but with the Paris Olympic Games upon us, as well as the European Football Championships, we thought it's quite important to look at that aspect. And it has lots of interesting issues around it. Not the ones that we'll hear on telly the next few weeks. How many medals will the British get? How will plucky England do? It's all about nationalism, commercialism, etc. People enjoy it, nevertheless, of course. But I'm not even starting to talk about the obscene amount of money in professional football clubs today. It's understandable then, perhaps, that some on the left look at sports as a kind of modern day bread and circus, it's to distract the people, the opium of the masses, as Marx has so often been quoted out of context when he's talking about a religion. But for many, it is undoubtedly an escape. Sports that is an escape, get a few hours away from the boss or, the missus or that kind of thing on the weekend. But it can actually be much more than that, something positive, a sense of collectivity. For example, if you like football, even if you don't like football, I'm not a big fan, but if you've been to Hamburg and at the Millantor, a game of St. Pauli is something entirely different. They might not allow Palestinian flags in the stadium or any flags, which is a bit problematic. But the chanting, the anti-racist banners, the music, the collective joy with St. Pauli is unbelievable. So we're going to look at a few aspects around sport tonight, theirs and ours, including the alternatives that existed to the Olympic Games. In fact, not one, but two alternative sport events. So I'm really looking forward to all of this tonight. We're starting with Peter Kennedy, who's going to look at the role of capitalist sport and leisure in the brutal colonization of human play and games. Over to you, Peter.
Sport's been pretty important to me in my life. I've always been interested in football, unlike Tina. And, the kind of joys of being associated with a club gives you an identity, and I suppose that's the thing with sports of all stripe. It gives you a sense of identity and belonging, even though we're not sure why or where it comes from. And, we often ignore some of the kind of contradictions of sports, where the money's coming from, in terms of football, the various owners of football, especially in the EPL, and their kind of roots and where they got the money from. And we kind of live with that contradiction a lot. And it says a lot about sports. It's pull and attraction and that kind of thing. And sort of, I suppose, like sports are ubiquitous, and it's just something that, we love it or loathe it, but we can't ignore it. I suppose that's the thing, in our lives. It's over 3 billion or so people take part in sports every year, of one type or another, grassroots level to elite. And billions, around 3 billion or so, watch regularly the four yearly Summer Olympics and the FIFA World Cup. And if you look at the sports merchandise, and even those I mentioned, loads for football or sport, then we tend to, the way fashion is branded these days, we can, go around saying I don't like sport, but we're wearing sports shoes, or we wear sports tops or hats, caps and that kind of thing, and as part of daily fashion and the mundane of life. So it's integrated into our culture, and the overall sports merchandise market, as they say, is phenomenal. And it's in 2022, 614 billion was spent on all sorts of paraphernalia in sport, which we either wear for sport or outside of sport. And then there's the fact that, football, the most working class of sports, attracts on average 33 million attendees, not 33 million people, obviously, to grounds across the four English leagues every season. And wouldn't like the socialist movement give their eye teeth for to be able to draw in a fraction of those crowds to their meetings and so forth. Roughly 2 million every week go to live attendances of the big 5 Euro leagues, including the Bundesliga and the EPL and La Liga. And we can go on and on with that. I suppose as well, you know, getting to the more brass tacks of it, sport mega events, which seems to take place every year at one type or another. You know, there are always like kind of rare events, but recently not so. And they act in a way to, as we well know, prize open lucrative deals involving a whole host of corporations in finance, in property, and in construction and transport, as well as the local and national governments. And they're kind of, you know, the corporate sports, if you like, are a kind of butterfly trap to secure capital accumulation that often leaves host communities all the poorer. And, you know, if you think on that in the past decade or so across these some FIFA and World Cup, FIFA and the World Cup and Olympic game events, then people living in districts across from around Sao Paulo and Tokyo and London certainly can't ignore the impact of capitalist sports in their lives due to the kind of vast changes in the way they live, the infrastructure there, where homes are displaced and so on. And even when sports is trying to be positive, then the same sports capitalists will cut they cut through barriers that have been there for quite a long time. So the gender barrier, for example, over recent years, more women included in commercial sport, but not for reasons of equality, but because of the potential market that it opens up. And as a recent report by PricewaterhouseCoopers puts it, I quote, executives see women's sport as a key growth opportunity. So that kind of says it all. So, you know, it makes you think, and we can go on and on about the way sport impacts our lives like a lumpet. But it begs questions about, does sport have any integrity for socialists today? If so, can we galvanise a workers' sports movement akin to those in the past? From the train wreck that the capitalist sport has become for humanity? Or perhaps capitalism has destroyed any integrity that sport may once have had. So, you know, I mentioned, intimated anyway, about workers' sports, and in the past it looked so different. And I know perhaps some this will be widened out in discussion tonight, but just to mention that socialists, in a way, you know, once saw the possibilities of working class sport as breaking with capitalist values and acted as a kind of like organising tool across the working class, culturally binding them together and developing a kind of solidarity in that. And so, you know, it was based around the human synthesis of playing games and sport in a kind of intricate way, which we'll come on to. And the idea is that in some way working class people would be able to promote through sport closer human bonds and in the vein of a socialist set of values. And obviously the big organisations which were set up after the debacle of World War I with the Socialist Workers' Sports International and then the Revolutionary Red Sports International to meet this challenge. And prior to that, obviously, the German SDP had a big movement, a big push, a big belief in the positives that can accrue from working class sports and getting stuck in and pulling working class people away from capitalist sports. And implicit to this was a belief in two dimensions of sports. You know, I raised this because of one dimension is kind of taken off at the expense of the other. And that is the belief in the intrinsic and the extrinsic powers of sport, which Tukul and Sahin below kind of express an idealized form as follows. The founders of the workers' sports movement believed that sport could be revolutionary. Sport played a paramount role in the struggle against capitalism, nationalism, and militarism, shielded youth from bourgeois values, banded together internationally to create peace and an international solidarity. And I suppose that's speaking to the extrinsic aspects of sport. And they go on, they turned physical culture into a new international language capable of breaking down all barriers a humanistic alternative to the excesses of bourgeois athletic competition. Not to do away with competition, but, you know, as a kind of humanistic approach, substituting socialist for capitalist values in the process and helping to lay the groundwork for a uniquely working class culture. And I suppose, you know, that speaks to the kind of intrinsic in a way. And socialists believe that, I think, you know, we're intimate or implied in the socialist tradition is this idea that there's a rebalance in a way, a reshaping of sport across these three points here that you can see that, you know, the relationship with play, relations of play, relations of games and sport. And in the past, you know, sport has not always been with us as long as playing games. And in a way, we can see that each of them are specific relations, and, you know, it's a minefield trying to define these separately. But I suppose one big crucial point to me is that the idea that, you know, the social formation, you know, society within which these three interplay together will decide which, you know, how they mix together, how they blend together. And it's my guess is that a worker sport would come from, in some ways, suppressing the commercialized nature that's inherent to sport and bringing it into governance of play and game relations. And I think that's imparted in a way and sort of manifest in the way the Socialist Worker Sports International and Red Sports International both develop sport in a kind of more broader way as festivals, including people in more all-round sports and less in terms of like reaching certain standards and so forth, making it more play-like, more games-like. And play, as we know in history, is fundamental to human nature. It's spontaneous. You know, it's not rule-bound. It's kind of like, it's part of one's pastime, how you pass time away from labour, away from work. And if you think play now, the way it has a, you know, within capitalism, it's kind of like, you know, a no-no to play at work. You know, sports are classified as work very easily. We can see the alignment between the two have been blurred. You know, top elite sports people and those further down the chain are workers, albeit maybe self-employed workers. But work is central to sport. With play, play is anathema to play is anathema to work and the work ethic. And games are kind of like a more coded form of play, whereby it's still about like the human element, about building solidarity, and it's not so much about jumping higher and running faster. In other words, the kind of metrics that are used in capital sport in a very abstract way, and which take place in specific fields of sport, in stadiums which are accurately measured, in pitch measurements and so forth and so on. So it's this amalgam of the three, and it's this tussle. And I would say that was like informed by, if we wanted to kind of frame that in Marxist terms, we would like point to the way Marx might include this within like the commodity form. And very briefly, all this is saying here is that, you know, the socialists in the era just discussed the approach sport as class struggle of the commodity form, perhaps, and Marx might have phrased it that way. I don't know. This is an assumption on my part. Certainly the way I would have framed it. Over the commodity form as a struggle over the relationship of play or between play, games and sport, and how that relationship is synthesized. And within the commodity structure of capitalism, there's a kind of like innate kind of, there's a kind of drive towards like commodifying sport. And in a way, that means that we have the subordination of play and games and some more serious kind of games and their sportification into kind of like more serious sports stroke games which accrue value. And so I suppose the gist of this point here is that there's a struggle indicated by the crap arrows there in the middle, and it's contested, and it's up to socialists and it's up to the left maybe to see this as an open-ended, more of an open-ended struggle of domination and control and contestation. And I think that was, I'm assuming this, but I would say that's not 100 miles from the way, international red sport and the early associates talked about it. So, but the more open dialectical perspective it was obviously given a knock in the head by the defeat of the working class after the 1930s, the onset of Stalinism and the Cold War, and sport became seen more of an instrument of social control, and workers' sports movements kind of ebbed away, and the socialist parties, which are kind of pushing for them, withdrew into the shells and kind of left worker sports to wither on the vine. And so we still have the inklings of resistance in sport, but without the movement behind it. And so along with that, there's a tendency on the left to see that, well, sport has given up the ghost. It's taken up, it's become commodified, basically. So by the time of the mid-20s or so, we're in that position, and that's a time when academic Marxists particularly in the 60s and onwards, and other Marxists in the West are seeing sport in a kind of one-dimensional way. This idea in the Frankfurt School and Marcuse, who talks about the one-dimensionality of society, where the all-round character of a person and culture becomes corroded and corrupt and flattened by the capitalist onslaught. And so quite a lot of Marxists, maybe you've been fed a large spoonful of Weberian pessimism, which Frankfurt School were inclined to swallow too, began to see in sport a means of capital accumulation, see in sport capitalist relations tooth and claw, and as a prison of measured time, as Brom would say. So, and these are kind of the texts, which are classic texts and maybe later text. Barbaric Sport was written in the 90s. Richard Brunet was written in the 80s, class sport and social development, and the essays by Jean-Marie Bron were from the 60s. So the one-dimensional Marxism does a really good job, maybe, of focusing on the exploitative character, but at the cost of marginalising that dialectic of play, games and sports. In a way, playing games were kind of truly colonised, brutalised and flattened by the sportification and the commercialisation of sports that took place then. So they do make a good point. I just want to go over there, some of the consequences of what they would say. In other words, taking that position that sport was a dead duck, then in terms of any kind of resistance there, then has some consequences in practice. And you'll find in Brom's work, for example, this the use of the model of production relations, capitalist relations, and athletes become alienate their labour power to owners of production, of sport, and then the sports owners employ coaches and sports scientists, which become line managers, which extract performances from athletes by whatever means. And the finished commodity, i.e. the game or the contest, is consumed by what seem to be docile fans and so on. Stadiums become factories, and sport is integrated with the working class into capitalism, with all the negative consequences. Now, that, in a way, what I'm trying to say now is that they have a point in a way, because it's like when you argue in a kind of laser-like focused way, well, you bring light to certain exploitative trends, even though you may squeeze out any ideas about it being a point of resistance anymore. And I suppose that in a way that produced some interesting ideas about sport the way it is today, which kind of fit in with your common sense view as well. And so, if you like, the idea now is that sport has become corporate sport has become global, and it's controlled and owned, if you like, by what are global empires, and they're obviously in need of systematic supply of athletes. So the global sports empires, which kind of consist of international entities, and they have feeder systems through their national partners or federations, who have feeder systems through the local club level and academy level. And while these don't always fit nicely together, we'll just assume that in a very general way, this sets the structure of capitalist sports today and makes it very hard for athletes to do anything else but commodify their kind of talents. And I always think at the bottom line, I always think of a particular way of doing sports as higher, become stronger, lift more weights, run faster around the track, jump higher and so forth, and these kind of demands on you. So it produces a global athlete feeder system, and you have from the bottom to the top, from school sports through local sports, through national sports, regional and elite sports. I've arrowed with elite and the regional, and then the national kind of infrastructure of that. And the impact that it has is that it creates an athletic feeder system which processes a hierarchy of talent shaped by the performance principle. And so in keeping in tandem, in sequence with this one-dimensionality, it orchestrates a kind of social Darwinian struggle to sort the wheat from the chaff. And this is enhanced, and the kind of ethics involved, which athletes then imbibe, are amplified through a kind of panoptic impact on athletes, which is intensified by the structure itself and the intense battle to become a part of the elite, or at least make it to regional level, and if not regional level, national, and if not national, local, and so on. That all this becomes amplified, and even through the sports industry and big data, so that athletes, in other words, ideologically become imbued with this kind of logic, if you like, logic of performance, or the kind of performance principle, which squeezes out the play and games. And this view then naturally would argue that the alienating consequences of the Darwinian struggle for success imposed by the feeder system is ingrained in the systematic violence and aggression in the name of sport that we can see, with culminating in an increase in injuries and burnout, and some injuries more serious than others, some more chronic, some more acute. But there's a kind of like, I know there's a lot of mimetic kind of violence involved here too. But the view is that, the message is that capitalist sport exploits, but it also wants to gouge our eyes out, smash our faces and slaughter those animals in the name of entertainment. So we can get lots of evidence of the violence in sport and the level of violence, and these kind of sorts of evidence are easily to come by. And some are more valid than others, but at least to give us an idea of the systemic nature of like injuries in sport. And so it's a far cry from the kind of socialist values that were kind of reflected on by earlier socialists who were inspired by the thought of creating a workers' sports movement. And the level of injuries mounts up over time, and they're quite systematic and prevalent, as the graph shows there. So I won't kind of like just sit there laboring through the graph. And there's a lot of other information from sports medical science where they note the increasing seriousness of injury amongst academy youth in all stripes of sport, where the repetitive strain involved in taking up specialist sports at an early age that make themselves felt on on the person, and they end up at a time when the bone structure is not fully formed and so forth. So there's plenty of evidence of this kind of nature. So what the kind of, that view of the commodification, if you like, of sport, and the brutal colonization of play in games, or the realignment of them within like a kind of sportification, which owes its values to capitalism. What's missing in that account, and the account of like Marxists today, quite a lot of Marxists today, academic Marxists as well, but also Marxists from particular groups, is that the kind of, while the right, in a way, the right maybe for the wrong reasons, and they create a one-sided appropriation of the commodification of sport and the closure of sport to the working class, and that, in a way, that kind of easy view, that kind of lazy view of like sport as being corrupt, part of like global corporations' accumulation strategies, about it being an ideological tool to integrate, subordinate the working class and divide them up. And basically the opium of the people, which they can't escape. And so we need to escape any talk about sport as being in any way progressive. But just the little like islands of like protest, in a way, in this period of time, after 30 years of, say, the neoliberalization of sport and the commercialization that's took place as sport has penetrated, as the market has penetrated and capital has penetrated more areas of sport, as we know from the mushroom of football, the EPL, and the way it kind of extracted itself in the 90s from the FA Football Association and developed this more hyper-commercial existence. But within that, and this is what this, I'd make the claim here, is that there are like islands of resistance. We don't have like a worker sports movement. We don't have like a socialist movement with their shoulders behind, involving themselves in to create a worker sports movement. But I suppose these intimations of resistance are evidence that it's always there as a potential, and sport can never ever extinguish its kind of dialectic between play, games, and sport. And so things like the movement, what's sometimes called the DIY movements, where fans of mainly football, who have become more and more estranged from their clubs as they become mega corporate enterprises, begin to create their own football within the community. And the classic case is the Football Club United of Manchester, which broke away in the early 2000s and has set up its own facilities, players. The advocate ownership between all members is equal, and so on. And so they're trying to inculcate that humane spirit back into sport again that's been missing, and to counteract the one-dimensionality of sport. And the same goes with the things like the against football, the modern football movement, which challenges, smallest issues which can have big results, challenges the commercialization of football, and especially so with the all-seater stadiums and the way the stadiums treat football fans as consumers and want to colonize their mentalities as consumers and act as butterfly traps for wealthy tourists and concert goers and all the rest of it. And so sport eventually becomes a sport attainment industry rather than something that is local to the fans. And so this is a wider movement across Europe. And then other examples like the Green Brigade of Celtic, this altar group, which protests about wider political issues, as mentioned there, and is not afraid to express solidarity for the Palestinian movement and Gaza at this time. The image on the right there demonstrates that, and many other fans involved were threatened with having the season ticket withheld and being barred from the club because of that. And the last little one there on the right hand side above is Republica International, and they're like a nice organisation from Leeds, set up in the 90s by a mixture of socialists and anarchists, and they, with the intention of playing socialist football with socialist values, where it isn't about winning for winning's sake and prize money and being top of the league, but it is about competition, but it's competition to produce like good performances, and it's about the quality of the performance, they say, over and above the quantitative aspects of success that you would see on the field of play in the EPL. And they play football across the world. They engage with left-wing movements and counter movements and so forth. So, if you have like an hour to talk about this, you can probably drill into it a bit more. But the idea is that, the socialists and Marxists need to sit back and how they reflect on sport as sport become colonized by capitalism. Is there a way out for sports? Can it be a form of resistance for socialist politics and all the rest of it? And I suppose that is the answer to that would be, for me, again, to go back where we started with Marx. Okay, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to end there because it's back to where I started before. And for me, as a Marxist, I would say that the answer is always to look beyond the kind of one-dimensionality of corporate sport, to see that because athletes are human beings and the people involved in the sport are human beings, then you can never ever leave out those essential innate human aspirations for play and games, and that will always find its way out into sport, no matter how commercial it is. And I suppose we can always think of examples of that in corporate sports, so I'll leave it there, and then we can.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was great. Thank you for that first introduction for tonight's sessions. One Marxist, well, there's actually two Marxists coming up who don't have that point of view that you discussed, but it is prevalent on the left. There are for sure certain organizations around who view sports with the sort of suspicion. We're going to look first now at Workers' Olympics and social democratic sports clubs, and we have with us Ben Lewis, who's a historian and author and has written on the Social Democratic Party of Germany of the 1920s and before. So welcome, Ben.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Can I just share my screen? Oh, no, I can't.
No, yeah, okay. You can. I had to quickly.
Sorry.
I'll switch it back on again. There you go.
There we go. So this is yeah, thank you for the introduction, Tina. I should also say that I'm a running coach. So one of the things that I see this kind of many of the great alienating effects that Peter so eloquently sketched out there on my day-to-day work as well. I have worked on the history of the worker sport and the Worker Olympics movement in the past. It's something I haven't done for a while, but I think is certainly worthy of more efforts in the future, not least because we are approaching a very important centenary in our movement in terms of a sporting movement designed to combat the ills of commodified sport and play, that was organized in 1925 in Frankfurt, Germany, by the worker sport movement of the Second International, which we'll talk about in a second. And it was a movement, it was an event, I should say, that was organized in direct competition with and in complete hostility to the 1924 Paris official Olympics 100 years ago that come around today. I wanted to start by kind of setting the scene for the worker sport movement. It has its origins in, as Peter said, actually, in the late 19th century, when you had things such as workers' educational associations, cooperatives, trade unions, and of course, the political parties. And this worker sport movement was always tied to significant mass political parties. That's worth mentioning. And in terms of this dialectic between capitalist sport and the opposition to it, and how play articulates itself, one of the driving motivations or factors behind the establishment of worker sport was not only to counter the kind of culture around official sport and the Olympics, which was, as you may know, kind of very aristocratic in outlook with its amateur, so-called amateur approach, highly jingoistic and nationalistic, etc. But it was also, I think, something more fundamental than that in terms of health and vitality, if you like. And if you read the leaders of the Second International, across the board, really, there was always this emphasis on the working class being the ruling class of the future. And insofar as it was that class, had to kind of learn and become strong enough, in a sense, to take over the ruling of society, and therefore counter the incursions of the logic of capital and profit kind of in all spheres of life and society. One key element of which we're talking about today is, of course, worker sport. Now, if you think about the way health and vitality, longevity, etc., is discussed in a modern context, there are a few points to be made, I think, because it's kind of very much the case that it's the right wing that's using this narrative of health, vitality, longevity, and so on, kind of packaged in a kind of individualist, self-reliance, personal responsibility and culpability discourse. If you think, for example, of the discussion so-called around obesity, right? Instead of looking as what the worker sport movement did, as kind of the social norms and factors that underline our lives today, and our lack of movement, our sedentary lifestyles, terrible and expensive food, etc., that feed into our lives quite directly. And, you know, we know now from, again, this is the kind of running nerd speaking, but we know now about the metrics of, say, VO2 max, muscle mass, bone composition, etc., in terms of living a long and healthy life, where we're still able to kind of go to the toilet by ourselves as we get older, etc., etc. But as I say, that science, if you like, has been kind of jumped upon by the right to as Peter was saying, to kind of capitalize it, to targetize it, etc. And as I say, worker sport had a completely different emphasis on health and development of the class as such in all spheres of life. Peter mentioned the various responses of the left. I won't go into that now, given time. But I think if we want a good understanding or a good starting point for worker sport, we have to understand that not only was it this thing about health and class development in that sense, but also about liberation. So Fritz Wildung, who was one of the pioneers behind German worker sport, where it was, of course, the biggest, said that sport in the interest of the working class means that sport liberates, he says, sport that liberates the worker. Now, in terms of the ideas behind it and this movement itself, it probably was news to even many of you here that we do have this centenary next year. It's the centenary of 1925, because as with the workers' movement generally, this particular episode of our movement, one which I think for all our criticism we can look back on with a certain sense of pride, has been subject to persecution, to banning, repression, and is in a sense being forgotten as a key kind of battleground in the struggle over the future of society. it's worth remembering that the three main worker Olympic festivals organized by the Second International after the split in 1914 were attended by more people than the official Olympics themselves, right? These were not marginal phenomena. They were mass and internationally so. And also, then you add in the, as Peter mentioned, the communist wing, the Red Sport International as well. That's another enormous contribution to that as well. These were big movements. Peter talked about the SPD. You could talk for days on the culture of that. The gymnastics clubs, the cycling clubs, the hiking clubs. Chess, jiu-jitsu in 1900s Germany was actually a thing in the SPD. And not only did these organizations bring together people and politicize them, etc., but they often had their own social democratic newspapers. One of my favorites, I mentioned this in one of my books, is the Socialist Female Gymnast, I think is the title of the particular publication of the SPD in the 1900s. So yeah, I don't want to go here in terms of the kind of checkered history of the movement, but of course, as I've made the point that the Lucerne Sport International, Socialist Worker Sport International, founded in 1920, the continuation, if you like, of the Second International, had over 2 million members in Germany alone. And then the Communist International's version, the Red Sports and Gymnastics Association, sometimes known as the Red Sports International, was founded a year later in 1921, which had the aim of, quote, the creation and amalgamation of revolutionary proletarian sports and gymnastics organizations in all countries of the world and their transformation into support centers for the proletariat in the class struggle. Now, so there are two major points to make here. First is that the workers' movement as such, as with many other spheres of society, drew a clear line and said, look, we need our own sport. We need our own entertainment industry. We need our own recreational industry, our health industry, etc., etc. We need a different approach altogether. That is why we will not participate in the official Olympic movement. And although there were occasionally some overlaps, there is an amazing episode, I think, in 1920s Vienna, where, talk about derby games. The Austrian workers' sport football team manages to beat the Austrian official national team in a game, which must have been some event. So yeah, on the one hand, there was this, we do not have anything to do with that sport. It is not ours. It is, the first Workers' Olympics in 1925 was organized under the slogan "No More War," which was a big middle finger up to the Paris Olympics of 24, which was again this kind of post-World War shifting order, rearmament, jingoism, etc. And there was a clear break with that, even on the part of the Second International, whose record on war, as we know, was rather inconsistent, to put it mildly. So you had that dynamic, but then also you had the question that the whole fate of these organizations, the two major ones, depended to a great extent upon the greater political developments, as you can imagine, within social democracy and within the communist movement. And it's only in 1936, during the Popular Front period, where there is an attempt is made in Spain. I've got the T-shirt here. To organize the Workers' Olympiad in Spain, mainly in Barcelona. That's a T-shirt from an event I'll talk about in a second. Olimpiada Popular. I can't speak Spanish, so I'll just hold it up. And what happens there, though, is that in 36, literally pretty much on the day with the Workers' Olympiad is to take place, the Popular Olympics, as it was known in Spanish, people coming from all over the world, Franco's troops march into Barcelona. And then we effectively see the outbreak of the Civil War. And that was the kind of death bell for the worker sport movement. It carried on in its own way in certain forms afterwards, but essentially, to cut a very long story very short, both in the Eastern Bloc and in social democracy in the West, after World War II, there is this kind of handing over the baton, if you like to use a sporting metaphor, back to the official Olympic Games, and it becomes, Cold War-ified about, the Russians versus the Americans and the Chinese now, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this kind of shift away from that in the context of so-called peaceful coexistence, but also the post-World War II social democratic consensus. And like I say, even though for all my criticisms of the Second International after World War One, it's really that some of the materials that they produce for these, you can see this is a official guide for the second one in Vienna in 1931. And you read some of the materials, it's crazy. It says here that this is in the official guide. It says, for sure, competition easily awakens animal instincts, but only if the spirit of humanity is absent. Nationalists know no humanity. We all have the same enemy, capitalism. And in all of these events, including, by the way, the Spartakiads, as they were called on the east in the Soviet bloc, there was an emphasis on mass involvement. So this kind of false distinction barrier between the participant and the observer is kind of torn apart, which isn't to say, by the way, that some of the records, the times, and all the rest of it weren't impressive. I mean, as I say, as someone who studies these things, looking at some of the performances, they were truly impressive. And you say you even had a situation where the Austrian workers' football team beat the Austrian team. I think that is all I will say for now. There are many criticisms to be raised that I won't go into now in this time. But clearly, mass worker sport was a product of mass political parties on an international scale, and I think that's the kind of elephant in the room here, if you like, if we want to be serious about it. But I think the legacy itself should be remembered. Insofar as, again, a class that spends its free time in front of the TV or Instagram or whatever as kind of isolated, passive consumers of the activity of others, does not make for a political thinking class, and it reinforces many of the issues that we see today in terms of social isolation and loneliness, and general, poor metabolic and cardiovascular health. We also have to say as well. So that's why I think the emphasis on rounded development, self-improvement in worker sport, the strengthening of the class as a thinking, acting class is one that's integral to the revolutionary project of human self-emancipation, and is, as such, is worth remembering almost 100 years on. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ben. Fantastic overview. Definitely next year, 100 years, I hope we can do some more around that to reclaim our history. Really important.
In Frankfurt.
Sorry, say again?
In Frankfurt.
Frankfurt. Well, or here in Sheffield and London, etc. But excellent. And before we take any comments from the floor, we thought we'd take all introductions first, and then we can have a discussion with the audience. Thank you, Ben. Our next speaker is John Reid. Also very pleased to welcome you. Hi, John. He's written, amongst other things, the book Reclaim the Game, and I will put a link in the chat, focusing on football and what the alternative could be there. So welcome, comrade.
Yeah, good evening, comrades. Just to go about my history, really, I've been involved in the socialist and trade union movement for over 50 years now. I'm retired now, but I still do casework for the RMT trade union. I'm secretary of the Queen's Park Rangers Loyal Supporters Association, which was formed in 1987. It's the oldest independent supporters association in England and Wales, and that was formed out of our struggle against the proposed merger of Fulham and Queen's Park Rangers. I was also involved a year later in campaign against ID cards, which a mass movement by fans around the country did defeat Thatcher's plans to bring in identity cards at football. And at the outset of the Premier League in 1992, which the team I support, QPR, sadly were involved in that breakaway league, I wrote the first edition of Reclaim the Game to warn about how this would lead to a massive divide in football, and sadly, that has come true. Now, Reclaim the Game deals with big business and football, but it also takes up anti-racism, it takes up women's football, and it puts a transitional program forward of how football should be run, and then a full socialist program of how football would be run in a socialist and hopefully eventually a communist society, how sports and football would be run. It also deals with the history of football. I think it's interesting when the Euros coming up. I come from an Irish background, so sadly Ireland won't be competing in the Euros. But I enjoy all sport. Will enjoy the Olympics, the Euros, cricket, etc. All of those particular industries, which they are now, are money making industries, and I think that it's important to state with football. I make the point in the editions of Reclaim the Game. Various forms of football have existed throughout the world for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. I think it can date back to China a couple of thousand years ago. Now, obviously, the formulated, structured game developed in England and Scotland and then quickly transferred around the world. I won't go into the long history of football, but it did start off as a scrap between two villages, folk football, and it was often used as a political demonstrations against land enclosures, etc. Now, moving on a few hundreds of years, we now have a situation where football is now an industry. It reflects the corporate neoliberal societies that we live in, where the rich get richer and the poor struggle or go to the wall. The same is true about football. Now, football, money has always been a factor in football. It was small business people that actually ran it, even though many of the clubs were formed by workers. They had a socialistic outlook. Arsenal were formed by munition workers at the Woolwich Munitions Factory in South London, and they wanted to be a socialistic sports club, but that was taken over by small businessmen. The same with Manchester United. They started off by railwaymen who formed a football club. There, they'd be probably turning in their graves if they could see what happened to both of those clubs that they actually set up. Now, clubs are owned by billionaires, or in the case of Manchester City or Newcastle United, owned by oil-rich states. Now, we can say that football used to be just discussed on the back pages of tabloid newspapers. Football now makes the pages of financial journals such as the Financial Times, the New York Times. Clubs are quoted on the stock market. We can go back to the 1980s, a precursor to the Premier League, where Tottenham Hotspur flouted Rule 34, and where they broke away from being a sporting institution to float on the stock exchange, and that opened the way up for other clubs to do that. There's a struggle going on in Germany at the moment because the majority of clubs have a 50 plus 1% rule, where supporters and fans have a controlling interest in the clubs. There is an attempt in Germany to reverse that and to look at the English corporate model. That is being resisted with demonstrations of clubs throughout Germany. Now, while we have the large corporate clubs throughout the world, we also have the situation, and this was outlined in my writings, that many clubs have gone into administration. We've seen in the past large clubs such as Portsmouth, Bolton Wanderers, Derby County, Sheffield Wednesday, Nottingham Forest go into administration. Bury, who were past FA Cup winners, briefly went out of business. They're now back again. Torquay are in trouble, whereas we see Manchester City flouting the rules, 115 infringements, but no penalties. In the last 7 years, they've won 17 trophies, and some would say that has been bought by cheating. But it is the fans who pay for the financial mismanagement of clubs. My own club, QPR, mismanaged by billionaires. They successfully built 2 relegation squads, these billionaires, overspent, and the club was fined 46 million for breach of financial fair play. As I say, beyond the glitter of the Premier League lies a dark abyss of financial meltdown in the lower leagues, in grassroots football, where clubs, as I said before, are going out of business and suffering. Clubs spend and spend to get to the football nirvana, or when they're there, the large corporate clubs spend billions of pounds on players, on wages. I had to check the figures when I was writing Reclaim the Game. When I saw that in his last contract at Barcelona, Messi was paid 143 million euros a year. I thought, well, that must be some sort of mistake. But this is the crazy money involved in football. Now, you have the situation where the other week, the playoff final in the Championship, Leeds versus Southampton. The winning of that match was worth £150 million in future monies that the Premier League guarantees. The actual playoff final had a larger crowd than the FA Cup final, which again shows that despite the idea of wanting to have these large corporate clubs, the lower leagues, often clubs get 30, 40,000 plus crowds because of the fan loyalty to those clubs, rather than the brand loyalty that the capitalists are trying to build up. Leeds' failure to go up. Some of the estimates say they're now 93 million in debt, and they may fall foul of the financial fair play. Leicester City, who actually did go up, spending large amounts of money on wages, face immediately the possibility of a points deduction to start the season. Now, the so-called Big Six clubs, the Manchester clubs, the United and City, Liverpool, Chelsea, Spurs and Arsenal, account for 78% of the aggregate commercial value of the Premier League. They now are arguing for a bigger share of television income. If you like, they want to totally take control of the market, of the football market. And the situation is that the divide between the top 6 clubs and the clubs below them, for example, in the Championship, the aggregate debts of clubs exceeds £430 million. Many of these clubs are technically bankrupt and are spending more money than they actually generate. As I say, it's this idea of trying to get into the Premier League and to get the share of the 4 billion or so that generates every single year. Now, we had a year or so ago and it's again I raised it 20 years ago and Reclaimed the Game, that the planning of a European Super League. Now, 20 years ago, when the European Cup, which used to be just for the champions of various domestic leagues, was replaced by the Champions League, which brought 3, 4, 2 teams or 1 team, depending on the coefficients. Again, another issue brought in to guarantee larger clubs and the larger superpower countries such as England, Spain, Germany, Italy to dominate European football. Now, that was brought in 20 years ago to appease the big clubs. but they weren't happy with that. They wanted to, and mainly to offset their debts. I mean, the irony is, as billionaires have come into football ownership, the actual football debt has massively increased. The big clubs such as Real Madrid, Barcelona, Manchester United. Manchester United is an interesting case. The Glazer family have actually taken money out of a club that was solvent and pushed them massively into debt. But these clubs, particularly in Spain, as I say, in Germany, there was a bit of reticence. The German clubs didn't, although they were in talks, they didn't come out and declare for a Super League because of the opposition in Germany. But Real Madrid, Barcelona were envious of the, as are the other leagues, of the amount of money the Premier League generates. Now, this Super League was going to be backed by financial giants JP Morgan to the tune of £3 to £4 billion. And this league of 20 or so teams would have been based on the financial generation of these corporations, the brand name of these corporations, rather than the performances on the fields. And there may well have been a very limited relegation from those leagues. Now, these particular teams try to push that forward, and again, it's to accumulate the wealth into the hands of less and less clubs, to set up a European league, and then possibly add into that by bringing in clubs from South America, North America, elsewhere, if you like, to build a world league to really accumulate the wealth, the football wealth, into a few hands. The richest 20 clubs in Europe have a combined wealth of 9 billion euros plus. Now, the big 6 English clubs want their cake and eat it too. The Premier League is beamed into 600 million homes in 202 countries. It generates 4 billion plus per year. Now, the mass movement of fans put a stop to the plans of a European Super League. Now, even though at the time it was mooted, clubs were in lockdown and there was no attendances, thousands of fans turned up at Chelsea, at Manchester United, Arsenal and Tottenham to show their disgust at the greed of these club owners, and to show solidarity with the larger football family that they did not want to leave behind. One banner outside of Stamford Bridge read, "We demand the right to attend matches on a cold, rainy night in Stoke." I'm sure most of the billionaire owners wouldn't even know where Stoke was. By the way, they probably don't even know where Stamford Bridge is either. Now, the huge groundswell of opposition shocked the owners, as did the response of ex-players such as Neville, Milner and Carragher. Now, they may be millionaires, but they come from working class backgrounds, and they respect the working class traditions of football. Now, facing a huge fans revolt and even a possible player strike, which was put forward, as was the banning of these clubs, the big 6 backed off. But they will come back for a Super League in the future, or some modified Champions League format. In England, they will come back for Game 39, which again was put forward a number of years ago, of playing an extra fixture away from England, of playing in New York, Sydney, Kolkata, etc., at a time suitable for the worldwide television viewing. I think in Spain, games already are played out of Spain, or there was an attempt to do that. Now, the Tory government was forced, after this mass opposition, to oppose the Super League, not because they got any love for football, or not that they don't agree with neoliberalism. They fear the masses, and they fear the movement of football fans, because it shows the massive latent power of the working class in society. The government feared if the cloak of naked capitalism was lifted in football, the working class would draw the conclusions about the rest of society. As with the National Health Service, the government had to pretend to care. Now, football may be a fantasy industry. We all, well, not everyone likes football. I do like to go, and it's actually entertainment through suffering at Queen's Park Rangers normally, but it's a fantasy industry. It's an escape from the drudgery of work. It is an opiate for the masses. But to paraphrase Lennon, that's John Lennon, not VI, it is bigger than religion. It is the people's game. And the fans have the power to change the game, as do the working class to transform society. I think the earlier speeches were excellent, and I don't think there will be breakaways from clubs. I think that people will try to transform their own clubs. I mean, we had the AFC movement when QPR weren't playing. I watched AFC Wimbledon on their way up through the league. That was a separate situation where the attempt to destroy Wimbledon from their own community was resisted. Now, there's also been a fan-led review of football. We would welcome any attempts to democratise as a transition, democratise football, the German model of 50 plus 1% ownership. But again, we've got to look at, even though that exists at a club like Bayern Munich, they are still a large corporate football club. And as are the majority of German clubs. As I say, there's a struggle in Germany at the moment to try to move away from this model. That is being resisted, and hopefully that will be defeated. The attempt to move to the English model. At Real Madrid and Barcelona, fans elect the president of the club, but the proviso is you have to be a millionaire to stand and win as president for those clubs. I'll go on to other issues in football as well, which I find worrying. The football industry is the only industry where clubs can sign children, can exploit children. They sign children as young as 8. They bring them from from all around the country, but also they bring the talent from the European leagues, bring talent from Africa and South America, which denudes these continents of their talent, a form of colonial exploitation. And when I say children are bought and sold, at my own club, Raheem Sterling, who'd been at QPR from the age of 8 or 9, was sold to Liverpool for £1 million as a 14-year-old. And, I don't think I have to go into to great detail of why we should oppose that sort of exploitation. But for every Raheem Sterling, there are the hundreds and thousands of young children that go through the system, the football system, and are rejected and thrown on the scrap heap. The effect that has on their future employment, their mental health, etc. By the way, again, it was covered up for years of also the sexual abuse that went on against children in the football industry, as it is being covered up in women's football as well, because they don't want anything to tarnish the image of this corporate money-making enterprise. Now, 97% of former elite academy players do not make the grade in football. 70% do not receive a professional deal. Many at 18, after 10 years at a club, as I say, are thrown on the scrap heap. If we move on to women's football, again, that's a massive game, particularly in the USA. Women's football is more popular than the men's football, and worldwide now, women's football is drawing crowds of at the highest level, crowds that were as good as, and sometimes I think for the European Championship, the women's final actually beat the record of any of the men's final. Now, the problem with the game, again, it reflects the game now is being dominated by, again, the top six corporate clubs. Doncaster Bells, which were an elite club in women's football, were forced away. They didn't fit into this corporate money making model. The history of women's football as well reflects society. During the First World War, women's football was drawing crowds of 50,000 plus, and when they suppressed it to again, if you like, part of the patriarchal system of where women worked in the factories during the war, were forced back out of the factories after the war. The same happened in football. Women were playing football at a very high level, drawing record crowds, and for almost 50 years, women's football was suppressed and banned in this country. Now, as I say, it is becoming popular. I agree with the first speaker as well. It's becoming popular because people see you can make lots of bucks out of the game. So that's one of the reasons now, if you like, the big corporate clubs throughout Europe are putting money into women's football and developing it. By the way, I think we should. It's a difficult one, really, because I would actually reduce the pay of footballers, but we'll come on to that when I talk about football under a socialist society. But women should be the pay should reflect the money they're generating in the game. The billions that the football industry makes could also subsidise ticket prices. Again, I was involved in the 20 is Plenty campaign. The maximum to attend a football match should be £20 for a ticket. In my book, I make the point out that going to a football match used to be around the same price as going to a cinema. It's way above that now. We've seen recently the Premier League clubs have upped their prices for the coming season. It's reflected in how young people are being forced out of the live watching of game, even the televised game, because you have to pay for large subscriptions from satellite companies. The average age of a Chelsea season ticket holder now is 56 years old. And that's the situation now. What future would I see under a socialist society? As I point out in Reclaim the Game, football evolved from a game which used to be a scrap between two villages, was frowned upon by the powers to be, and it developed into the beautiful game that we know now, which was developed mainly by working men. Obviously, later working women played in leagues as well. It was these working people that instigated the rules, formed teams to play against each other, and football became hugely popular and spread from these shores to become the world game, the people's game. But gradually, small businessmen took over the game. Today, big business, nation states, corporations have hijacked the big clubs in world football. This process reflected Thatcherite society and neoliberalism. Started in the late 1970s, let the strong survive, and let the weakest go to the wall. Unless the game is transformed, many clubs will die. The game can only survive by us reclaiming the game. The development of football was and is linked with the development of capitalism and the profit system. The fight to democratize football is linked with getting rid of big business. It's getting rid of this parasitic capitalists who are bleeding the game dry and bleeding fans dry as well. The ownership by billionaires has added to football debt. It hasn't solved any of the problems. As I said earlier, the worst example is the Glazers, who have taken hundreds of millions of pounds out of the game. We need to drive these parasites out. If big business did not control and run football, how would it be run? A socialist society would guarantee and protect the existence of all clubs. Clubs are an integral part of working class communities. Clubs would be community run and non-profit making. Supporters would not just be involved by turning up to watch. There would be a proper club structure where people would enroll to the club of their choice for a nominal fee. It would be a sports club, so you could have not just football, other sports could be played as well. It would be part of the community. By the way, you have a situation where even now, under the capitalist structure, because of the working class makeup of the running of people who run the clubs, a lot of community work is actually done by clubs. My own club, QPR, when you had the Grenfell fire, the corporate murder of 72 people in Nottingdale in West London, where I grew up, QPR actually opened up and got involved in providing food, providing clothing, providing help for the local community. So that embryo exists amongst football clubs. I'll say that this community-run football would involve all fans. Some, as they get older, just watch like me, but they would be able to play in leagues based on ability. As I say, people of all ages, men, women, able-bodied, disabled, will be able to play for their club. Now, club members through elected committees would be involved in the day-to-day running of clubs. Again, then you would have national football and international football, again run by elected delegates from clubs, forming committees to look at the rules and look at how football and sports was run. In a socialist society, players and staff would receive good wages, but wages would be democratically decided and would be tied to the average wage of a skilled worker, with differentials based on the level played at. We must link our fights against big business in football to our fight to overthrow international capitalism and to fight for the liberation of humankind by fighting for world socialism, which would rid our planet of the horrors of war, disease, hunger, the ecological mess we're in at the moment. This has been created by international capitalism in its quest for profit. Let us rid not only sport of these parasites, but let's rid society of these parasites, and let's fight for the organisation of sport on a socialist basis and the organisation of the planet on a socialist basis. Thank you, comrades.
Very well put. Thank you very much, comrade. We have a couple of people with their hands up, so I'm suggesting we take a few comrades' questions and contributions, and then Peter and Ben, I mean, either you can come in the discussion as you wish, as and when, or you can respond at the end if you can stay to the end. We'll be finishing by 9 p.m. the latest. Okay, first with his hand up was Ian, if you could switch on your camera and microphone. And then Matthew. Hi, Ian.
Good evening, comrades, and thank you for 3 excellent talks. I thoroughly enjoyed all of them. I just wanted to make a small point because a couple of people mentioned sport as an opium of the people. And of course, this phrase is bandied about a bit. And of course, people who are more familiar with Marx will know that Marx wasn't talking about narcotics. He was talking in terms of, the fuller discussion of the quote is, the sire, religion is the sire of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. But actually, earlier on in that particular passage from the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, it talks about religion as it is the fantastic realization of the human essence, since the human essence has not acquired any true reality. The reason why I raise that is because of the importance of collectivity for what it is to be human, and the way in which being part of a collectivity is part of the joy, for example, of being at a football match. It might be an alienated form, it might be distorted, it might shade off into all sorts of aberrant forms like nationalism or sort of local feuds or whatever. But still, the sheer joy of being part of that collectivity, I think, is part of the attraction of football in particular, perhaps, but sport in general. I never particularly loved professional sport because it always seemed to be something that was way out there, something that you could never really aspire to. I used to, interestingly enough, as a boy, I supported QPR because I'm from Queen's Park in London, and but later on in life, living in the Midlands, supported Wolverhampton Wanderers. But the thing that really struck me about the importance of collectivity was actually something that Ben Lewis involved is running. I was never really moved by the Olympics because I could never really ever imagine myself running in the Olympics. But the London Marathon, which I first did because I got a charity place, and it, got me out of stopped me being so fat and other things. But the sheer joy of being among tens of thousands of people all engaged in a simple act of enjoying what it is to be human was a really striking feature of it. And the other aspect of collectivity, which always struck me as important, particularly in the 1970s, growing up as I did in London, when there were regular fights between football fans, fighting each other, but also fighting the police. And of course, then that wasn't lost on the state either. And so the move towards, for example, all-seater stadia, ridiculous ticket prices, which was partly a consequence of it. I mean, the idea of football being it was a good, cheap afternoon's entertainment at one time. Not only that, but you could go and have a few beers, take even the horrible weak beer that they sell at football matches and take it onto the terraces, and you can't do that anymore. And anyway, it was just that whole joy of collectivity which was part of it, and I think it's part of what it is to be human. And it's why it explains why sport continues to be and will always be an integral part of what it is, not only to be human, but part of the very human essence, even if it's in a sort of somewhat alienated form. That was all I really wanted to observe. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. So, comrades, the main speakers, if you want to speak, just indicate to me and I'll bring you in. Otherwise, I'll just go through the people who've got their hands up at the moment. Matthew. Oh, sorry, Peter. Why not Peter? Peter has hand up. Go on, Peter. You have to unmute.
Oh yeah, yeah. Just like that idea about the opium of the people that Ian mentioned, but the other part of that quote that he mentioned and Marx writing on Hegel about it being, the essence of humanity as well, religion. And I suppose it does kind of capture some of the dynamics of football for working class people, definitely. And it's like the thing. What I always thought of as well as you said that was the way owners, and they may be big mega books, global owners, with fancy names and not live in the country, but they all say the custodians of this great local traditional club, and the fans really own it. And so I suppose in a way, in a backhand way, they realised that as well, that quote that Ian just put together there. So they realise that it's both something that people are not going to give up without a struggle, and they have to be told that they actually own it. It's a funny old thing. And it also reminded me when John was speaking, John Reid, and he mentioned that, about clubs, kind of being in debt and that kind of thing. And part of the debt is because fans demand their success for their club, not because they want to get more money in, but because they want their club to shine, and in shining, kind of like they shine too, and their community, sort of resonates with the victories of that club, and so that means going out and buy the best players. A club that I support, seems Ian's mentioned Wolves, I'll mention Everton. Now they're in a dire strait too, and for some of the reasons that John mentioned there. So, but the thing about Everton, is that they, in a funny old way, they too were in that situation because the club has been probably one of the longer ones in the EPL. It's probably only Arsenal different, but they fell between two stools of being not quite the elite clubs and not quite the dross at the bottom, who's kind of go through the net. And so, but that made them a kind of sticky wicket because fans were demanding even more than when the big owners come in, Mashiri, for example, the Iranian billionaire, to pump in some money and get those big players. And so that forced them into debt as well, So, but when Everton began to lose games again, if you're a customer, if you're a straight cash nexus kind of relationship in terms of capitalism with the owner and the workers, then you walk away because it's a spoiled commodity, but you don't see the club as a commodity. So it doesn't act like a business. And and the outcome of that is that most clubs are in debt, even the big ones. There's not many clubs that are actually making a big profit. And if they do, it's not from the core football. It's from all that goes on around them, the media rights, the sponsorship, the marketing, the game money. It doesn't match up to those kind of outer sources. And that's transformed football into an entertainment industry. And that's what fans hate as well. So,
Matthew, before I bring you in, we've got 30 minutes left. So if you could keep your contributions quite sharp, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, right. Okay, well, we're talking about more unfortunate football teams. I'm a supporter of Partick Thistle. So the point is, I think, really, it's this sort of contradiction of, you look at a game like cricket, it's actually being ripped apart, being destroyed. You look at a game like football, it's at the same time, in what you've got various forces, as Peter has said, in terms of the demand for money to be put in, and at the same time, this whole business of saying, well, okay, actually, what you're doing is excluding people and excluding whole countries. Actually, the smaller countries in Europe, like Scotland, of course, have been driven to the margins. And we actually sort of see this situation where, as John has said, there is a trade in teenagers. There's a whole series of teenagers in academies in Scotland who will never be seen by Scottish football fans because they get bought out, usually by English teams who have a lot more money. And and obviously the trade in kids, as John has said, also extends to Africa and more serious forms of exploitation, as well. But the thing, you've also got the situation, where you had at one point pre what you call Bosman, which is basically where clubs could control players. And when that ended, of course, what happened was that the players went where the money was, and the actual net effect was to make most players poorer, but some players very rich. And so, therefore, you get the situation where, say, if you're a club like Dundee United, who actually somewhat over 30 years ago achieved a European Cup final, they'll never do that again. Aberdeen won, Aberdeen won 2 European trophies. They'll never do that again. So, and as I say, you could go through Europe, countries like Austria or Portugal or the Netherlands are just being pushed to the margins. And in fact, all of European football has been concentrated in about 4 or 5 countries. At the same time, what you're seeing, of course, is a situation where clubs are basically being sustained by their fans. I mean, most clubs now, I mean, it doesn't add up. It's only there because the fans want it. I mean, Partick Thistle have gone bust twice in my time. Been bailed out. You can go look at the big wall of names of people who gave money and so on to keep the damning up. That's happened twice, and that shows you the degree of the importance of it. It's not to do with business. It's to do with people's interest and their passion for the thing itself. And the problem being, of course, is it's unsustainable within capitalism. The interesting thing, actually, of course, is also what you're seeing is a tendency towards fan ownership, because they're the people who hold the damn thing up in the first place, and therefore, because there isn't money to be made at it by owning it, therefore the fans have it. The fans actually get it because they're the people who mean things. So there's a whole series of clubs in Scotland. Some of them quite major clubs like Hearts and Motherwell and so on, but are now owned by the fans, and including Partick Thistle, which is majority owned by fans now. Principally because that's the only possibility. The question is really what politically that then means in terms of the function of, as you say, is it democratic? Is it democratic what politics are expressed? And the rest of it. Obviously, you take the likes of Celtic, which is actually owned by people who take money out of the club. Then the main thing they've got is to try and suppress the likes of the Green Brigade. Them and UEFA together, basically say, well, we don't actually want these people. They've tried to drive the Green Brigade out of the stadium. As I say, the Green Brigade also, of course, takes the football so seriously, they established a team in the West Bank, in Palestine. So to be serious about their politics. So there is that whole thing in those terms. The contradiction between capitalism and football and community. But the question is, whether you've actually got a political instrument which can draw out the lessons from that. Thanks.
Thanks, Matthew. Mark.
Hiya. For those of you who don't know, I myself have written around 20 football books, the vast majority of which are about clubs and players prior to World War I, and I would be acknowledged as a football historian. I've worked for the Professional Footballers Association, putting up plaques for them of legends of the game. Firstly, sport. I mean, sport is an escape. There's no question about that, whether you're doing it at an amateur level or at a professional level. It also keeps you fit, and that shouldn't be forgotten. And it's worth talking to any young people, in my view, as a youth worker myself, that sport is essential to life, because it does keep you fit and it does keep you healthy. And anybody who has an attitude that they're going to do sport throughout their lives will end up fitter and probably healthier and happier than anybody else who doesn't do that. That's my experiences, and that's what I believe. And that'll be the case under capitalism or not under capitalism. I thought, John Reid, I thought the talk was excellent. I must say I strongly disagree with him that the working class set up the rules. However, first football club was Hope Football Club in Edinburgh, 1824 to 1841, and that certainly wasn't working class. And they set up the rules by moving away from actually picking up the ball. I ain't got a lot of time, so I want to go very quickly through the football and the opposition by football fans and people in general around football, which I think has been positive. The other thing, what I would say is, in terms of mob football, if anybody wants to see what England was like in the 15th, 16th, 17th or 18th centuries, and I would say this before anybody dies, they should go at the Ashbourne, Shrove Tuesday and Ash Wednesday football. There's simply nothing like it. The numbers of people that take part, but it gives you an example of what the English countryside was like. I think it's essential that all socialists go and attend and actually have a look at it, or anybody, and also it's a really good day out. A couple of things. Obviously, it was the place that smashed up the organised football matches, mob football, when the place that came in 1829. Dead quickly. Obviously, people will have heard about how obviously there was a pace on Christmas Day, and people came out of the trenches and kicked the ball between the Germans and obviously the British. It was seen as a great revolt by the people in charge of the military, and had to be put down. Football for working class lads like myself, generations. The hope and ambition was that it would get you out of a factory. I started working in a factory obviously as a kid, worked there quite a long time before going to college, but that was the hope and the ambition. So in spite of the fact, yes, there's terrible pain if you don't make it, the fact was anybody would give that up gladly, to give up a factory work to actually become a professional footballer. And I've written a number of books with professional footballers, Charlie Hurley, Stan Anderson, Roy Massey recently, who ran the Arsenal Academy for donkey's years, did have lots of young people under his charge and did his best to make sure that when they themselves didn't make it, they moved on to other jobs. One of the good people in the game, I would say, and all of them would tell you, despite the aches and pains that they received, that their job and the occupation as a professional footballer was one that 90% of working class kids would want to be involved. I don't think we should ignore the Hillsborough Justice campaign about the people that were killed, obviously at Hillsborough, which changed the face of sport. In some respects, what happened is the ruling class did use that to introduce all-seater stadiums, price out people like lots of other people. The World Cups, for example, up until 1998 were all affordable. Now even an average game in the World Cup will cost you 100, 150 quid to get into matches. So it's just not possible to do that. So the watching of the games has definitely become much more middle class. I'd also say, however, as a supporter of the only football club that was ever set up by a labour movement organisation, which is Sunderland Football Club, which was formed by the Teachers Association in 1880, which I'm particularly proud about. That the getting into games, if you can afford a season ticket for kids under 16, certainly at Sunderland and at other places, exceptionally cheap. My son's now gone 16, so his price of his season ticket will go up to £110. That's for 23 games. That's for a fiver. His season ticket until this season was £26. So if he wants to go to see Sunderland play on a regular basis, which he does and has done since he was about 4 years of age, it costs about £1.50 to get in. I don't think you can find a sport which is actually cheaper than that. Non-league football, until he's 16 on average, he gets in for £1 or £2. So there's been seasons where he's gone to games of 60-odd games and paid less. Certainly the away games are more expensive. So there is that possibility. I think obviously we'll all record the 1968 Olympics with the two black athletes doing the black power things. The PFA, of course, was set up because footballers were being dreadfully exploited. That's it. I can think of other things which I'm quite proud of. In 84, for example, those of us who fought the police, certainly at Easington, were nearly all Sunderland lads who went to away games, and we did do our best. Anti-fascist action, which did more to drive the fascists off the streets of London, certainly in the early 1990s, which I'm proud of, and quite a few of my comrades were sent to prison as a result of that, was largely formed from Manchester United, Cockney Reds, and other people from outside there. And we had a fierce gang, which the fascists actually feared, which I think was what we should always aim for politically. We should always try and make them fear fear the left. If we can't knock the fascists off the streets, then we're not going to be able to knock the ruling class off the streets. Plenty of other things I can say. The protests over pricing by some fans has been fantastic and has reduced ticket prices. The other thing I want to briefly say is, as an anti-racist, even from the age of 12 or 13, it was the arrival of black players in football clubs which actually changed the attitude of many, many football fans. It was much easier afterwards to say you can't engage in racist abuse because we've got a black player. That might be simplistic, but these answers sometimes are simplistic. I'll shut up now. Thanks for your time.
Well, I mean, shut up for now, but I think you've volunteered yourself to do perhaps an introduction sometime on
I'm happy to do that. Problem is on Thursdays I'm often working now. I look after somebody, so it's 50-50 to be fair. So
we'll be in touch, but that's
okay.
fascinating.
No problems with that. None at all.
John wants to come in. Sorry, you're muted, comrade. You have to unmute.
Yeah, sorry, that was really interesting, Mark. And just to say, the issues you've raised are all covered in Reclaim the Game. We have a similar history. I mean,
I think I bought your book 20 years ago, the first one.
Yeah. But I think that raising the issues of racism in the book, but also the involved in the action and activity. On the history of football, there's always that argument whether the middle class form football in the public schools, but I think there was always the element of the masses being involved. It was suppressed, as you say, the political game.
I'm not disputing that, John. Obviously, that's something I've really researched massively. You know what I mean? Yeah.
No. What I would say is football. I make the point in the book that the Southern-based game was a very individualistic game, and the professional game brought from Scotland to the north of England, it reflected the of that community, that solidarity in the workplace was reflected in the passing game in that particular game in football. Well, we could discuss that. We could discuss that.
To be honest,
forever.
John, I'm just finishing up a book on John Goodall, who was the Englishman, the greatest Englishman of his generation, and he was obviously a Scots player. He was actually Scottish in essence. So I'm literally just finishing that book off. So I've just been, tangling with it. Yeah, I'm happy to say.
But also, I think Mark, maybe one stage. I mean, a good friend of mine, Stan Bowles, and I remember visiting him with Terry Hurlock, and Terry Hurlock's. None of these players have any money or any backing. But the sad cases of dementia now really need. Again, the football industry is doing nothing to support these legends who built the fan loyalty over decades. But
I'm struggling with working with a lad who's an alcoholic on his autobiography, and that's
anyway. We better not dominate this discussion, Mark. Let other people.
We'll get back to it. I think during the European Championship, it would be a good timing, perhaps, to revisit the issue. So a fascinating discussion, but we'll have to finish up a little soon. Marianne.
I mean, I'm a great lover of football, cricket. I mean, when I was young, I used to. My school was right by the Oval Cricket Ground, and many a time I'd be watching the cricket rather than be in school. But I'm pleased to find out about John, and that I'm going to get that book and read it, because for me, as a Manchester United supporter, I've hated it since the Glazers took over, and what they've done to the club. But I think what we have to think about is how we're going to win back football for the working class by us taking over control of it and democratising it as well, because I think that's really, really important. I mean, what the Premier League with the FA Cup recently, when they're trying to stop replays, which for a lot of the smaller clubs can be a lifeline, and there's campaigns against that. But also, I mean, the thing about hating football, there's a campaign now because of the amount of dementia to stop heading in the game of football. And for school children now, they're not supposed to head the ball to give some protection. But I think we have to start fighting back to get control over our sports. And I mean, I do go to some women's football games, and luckily it's reasonably cheap. I mean, before Manchester United had a women's team, I used to go to Birmingham City women's team. And you're right, a lot of the clubs that were for the foremost in the women's football, like Doncaster Bells, they were kicked out when the WSL was set up. And who decides that, and on what basis? You know, this should be something that the people that support the game can have some control over it, like the working class. You know, it is mainly a working class game, but it's been priced out of a lot of working class people who can't afford to pay that. And it's a lot of money. I mean, luckily in the women's matches, they don't charge very much at the moment. You know, you can go for a game for under a tenner if you. Well, that might be because I'm an old age pensioner, but it's a lot cheaper than the men's game. And I think we need to get more control over our sports. You know, I love watching the Olympics. I love watching sports, but unfortunately, politics are coming into it in a bad way. And as I say, we have to fight. And we have to fight to democratise sport and to take control over it. We shouldn't let these multinationals and these big corporations steal our games and stop the participation and pricing working class people out of sport.
Absolutely. Thank you, Marion. Anthony, then Paul, and then we're gonna.
I think we have to look at. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I think what we have to look at is the Marxist contradictions of capitalism, because it's the centralization of capital and the concentration of capital in fewer hands. They're making less profit. That's why Trotsky talked about fictitious capital, because they can't find the profitable outlets and all these kind of contradictions. But I'd like to know what Ben did about the SPD after the First World War, because that could have been the impact of the Russian Revolution and also to control the working class base. But I'm very confident with what Peter was saying about can we build up an alternative movement to the capitalists and sports. I'm optimistic because we're heading now for a big financial crisis. That's what they've had this election on. I think they don't want to spend the money on the mass. They might have to some extent, so working class base. But there's big pressure for change, and we could get in. I think what we could do in other parts of the world is actually have alternative sports and get involved in that way. But there's two. I agree with you about the transitional movement, but we're still using the opportunist manner like Millicent did in the 70s and 80s to adapt to left reformism. You guys saw what the conscience is. Ultra leftism and not intervening where the workers are in the battle for the problem mostly dominating football. And I mean, all the price and Marion said is very, very important. But I'm quite optimistic of change. But I'd like to know more about the workers' alternative games in the 20s, what impact Stalinism had. But I'll leave it there. It's just coming to an end now.
Thanks, Anthony. Paul. I think his camera doesn't work, so I can hear him.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yeah, I just wondered, there were three great talks, got loads from all of them. I just wonder if the panelists can talk a bit about what they think about some of the kind of left-wing fan culture, and that seems to be a growing trend at kind of non-league level and beyond, you know, and European wide and everything, and also a bit about what people think about the culture within left-wing organisations themselves, because like from my experience, there's a lot of meeting in pubs, drinking and stuff, and I've got nothing against all that, but like, you know, there's lots of young people coming to the left, and should they be guided into that kind of culture? Is that healthy, and are there alternatives? You know, and should, you know, parties and groups have more of a healthy lifestyle type of I don't know, culture, or try to foster that. You know, and from what Ben was saying, that does seem to be, there's a historical legacy of that in the workers' movement, you know. But anyway, it was a great meeting.
Thank you. Okay, we've got 10 minutes to go, and I think Ben hasn't come back yet, so I suggest you go first to sum up, and then John and Peter. But yes, I agree. 3 very interesting introductions and very good discussion as well. Ben.
I don't have a hell of a lot to say because partly I'm not an expert on football. I do think there is the question with all of these things and looking at the history of it. To what extent do you operate through the existing clubs? To what extent do you create your own institutions? And to what extent are those projects actually part of the same project? Right. That seems to be an interesting question. So, you know, in the a lot of the clubs that were set up in the Worker Sport International Football Clubs, they would be at least initially alternatives to the existing clubs in, say, very big football countries like Germany and Austria in particular. But to me, I say it's not an either or, but I do think we have to look to our own strength in the first instance. But I say that as somebody who's not, I say, not particularly massively into football in the same way as athletics or something. 2 questions though directly to that were directed towards me. The workers' movements, so the workers' sport movements in the 1920s, yeah, as I kind of briefly alluded to, they were under the sway of the dominant political organization. So I would say, you know, and I've written this elsewhere, by the 1920s, clearly the SPD, the German SPD is it's not a straightforwardly pro-capitalist party in the sense that there's a formal commitment at least to Marxism and socialism. Still, there's a left-wing mass membership to a certain extent, but yes, it's clearly integrated into the Weimar Republic. It's one of the founding parties in it, and it administers capitalism, right? So that, you know, as an organization, it has betrayed some of the founding tenets of what it stood for. What's interesting to me, though, is then if you go and look at some of the material produced by the Socialist Workers' Sport International under the aegis of these parties like the SPD, is the radical tone that's outlined within them. So again, one of my favorite quotes from the first Frankfurt one is in the official guide. It says, "We want to show our enemies, i.e. the bourgeois world, that we can do it better, that we can do sport in a better way." And I think so that's an interesting tension, right, between the some of the hopes and aspirations of the rank and file people involved in the Second International Sport Movement and actually what some of their people were doing. And indeed, in the article that Tina's just sent, I write about how even in, you know, you have statements like that, but then you have formal endorsements by people like, you know, Emil van der Velde, you know, incredibly chauvinistic pro-war guy, and others. So there's a definite contradiction there. Also, the way in which the 2 internationals related to each other is interesting. So you obviously have this split, but the split didn't play itself out equally across all sections and indeed in all nationalities. So one of the biggest cycling clubs in France, in Paris, for example, they didn't split. They actually kept together, not because of any kind of political affinities or likeness, but they just wanted to keep their league structure and records and the whole thing that they'd set up intact, which again raises questions about what can sport achieve politically, what can politics achieve in the realm of sport. But that's another question entirely. But the interplay between the two is obviously inseparable from greater developments in the world. Now, you also mentioned Stalin very briefly. And yes, you know, you can see that in the way that the Workers' Olympiads play out. So in 1928, a not insignificant date, you have the first Moscow Spartakiad, I think is the way that's the German phrase, the Soviet Olympics. And that is held as in opposition to what's going on in the social democratic movement. But like I said, with the Popular Front turn, there's a kind of official rapprochement then at the top, which almost leads to what would have been the biggest popular Olympics workers. And that T-shirt, by the way, is from a 10K run you can still do every year in Barcelona that's organized there. A great example of kind of a pocket of worker sport to commemorate that occasion. In terms of the left and culture, I mean, my basic point is essentially the one I made in the opening, is that it's fine to look at, you know, left-wing countercultures, St. Pauli, Celtic, you know, in football and all these other different things. But fundamentally, I think one of the benefits, the great benefits of looking back to history is to see how far our ambition has fallen slightly, right? I'm not, again, this is no disservice to St. Pauli or Celtic or all the, the Manchester United movements, grassroots movements in sport generally. But I think fundamentally to achieve the kind of things that we would like to achieve in society more generally, and particularly in sport in particular, the subject of this this discussion, they are the products of mass political parties. So yes, I do think the left is poor, for example, on the question of general the left does this kind of thing, the revolution will come tomorrow, let's just all smoke and drink, and do you know what I mean, who cares? I think we've lost that. There is as I said, there's a kind of health aspect which I think has been lost in and again, being healthy and happy and a rounded human being should not be something that the right tells us what to do, is to pull up our socks and have the right grind set mentality or whatever, as we often hear today, right? So I think that's something that needs to be taken seriously. But fundamentally, mass worker sport was a product of mass working class political parties, and I think that is that's the one thing that I think should be at the foreground of our discussion on this. But yeah, thank you very much.
Absolutely, thank you very much, Ben. John, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good. Right. Yeah, I'll just raise a few points. I think it's been a really excellent evening. The interesting thing is my team, QPR, are still technically, I think, in the top 10 richest clubs if you look at the owners. I took part in a fascinating film, The 4-Year Plan, when QPR were taken over by the members of the Grand Prix circuit. And I mean, I did say there, after saying they're trying to, they don't understand how football's run. The football is a working class sport. But also, these owners came onto the pitch at QPR and said, within 3 years, we'll be playing European football. And the whole crowd laughed at them, which, again, I think put it in perspective that they don't really understand. You don't attend teams like QPR expecting to win things. I mean, for instance, QPR's gates, actually, we sold out every match towards the end of the season, facing relegation. Now, I think the football industry, if you look at the question of health, and let's be fair, the Victorians were worried about the health. I think the actual health of working class people actually suffered when workers were taken from the countryside into the factories, and they did need a question of sporting activity to have a fit working class, also to regulate the working class as well. Interestingly, over the neoliberalism, over 5,000 playing fields were lost in England and Wales. I'm not sure about Scotland. Probably the same happened there. So the actual facilities for young people, of youth clubs, of playing fields, has been destroyed. And if you like, elite centres are set up in all sports now to develop youth. Thousands of young people cannot participate. But it's not just the football industry. That happens in athletics. It happens in tennis. It happens elsewhere. The question of the music industry as well. I've often wanted to write a book about the super exploitation in the music industry, which is even more interesting what's happening to football. But it is the question of, I won't get into a Marxist discussion, is there such a thing as working class culture? But I believe there is. Whether it's a subculture, we can go into discussion about that. But if you look at working class culture, the only way we can democratically control that, if you like, to enjoy ourselves and fulfill ourselves as humans, is to transform society, to cut the working week to a 20-hour working week, of having more leisure time, of having control of our leisure facilities. We cannot do that, by the way. I think one of the speakers was going on about transitional program and reforms and militant. Well, I've been a member of Militant Socialist Party for 50 years. We can get into that discussion another time, comrades. But I think there has to be, if you like, transitional demands, and then obviously pointing out they're only transitional, will be taken away by the ruling class. The only way to guarantee the liberation of humanity is overthrowing by revolutionary methods this system and installing socialism. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, John. Peter, you're summing up, please.
I'll just keep it brief, and just on the point of left-wing culture in football, and I think it's issue-led. I think like left, football is working class culture. Then in the past, the left-wingedness of that culture was from the communities which had a strong working class presence within the community in terms of the work, in terms of the their outside life, and how that was expressed within the community. And it seems to me that during that period, if you look back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, then there was no like left-wing protest or fans within football, but it's a kind of surrogate for the collapse of the working class, because of neoliberalism, as they call it, and the kind of reposition of the working class globally, and sort of fragmentation of unions and dismembership of communities. The one thing that was left was football, and so that became the subject of left-wing politics. But it was an issue-led thing because it was around football, and it was reactive against the very things that had destroyed and atomized the working class in the Thatcher years. So there's a stronger attachment to football within the working class communities, and that imposed itself as a reaction against commercialization, and that produces these left-wing one-issue group standpoints, which are okay. I'm not disparaging them, but things like the modern, the movements against modern football and stuff like that are these issues, and so they're always going to find it. Comes back to what Ben says, and I agree with Ben and John that it's down to, it's not sport in itself, but it's kind of like what sport gives us and how that can be empowered within a movement, an existing labor socialist movement, because of what it says about human beings, and when you take it out of that, then it could be just as malign as any other commercialized, commodified culture. And we can react in a left-wing way, we can react in a right-wing way. And isn't that the story of the ultras, right and left,
Comrades, fascinating discussion tonight. Brilliant contributions, very good discussions from the floor as well. Thank you very much for participating, and rewatch this when the Paris Olympics is on, or the championship, the European, and you get bored of all the chauvinism, etc. Though some people enjoy that kind of thing. Comrades, next week we're starting a mini series on the general elections, and we're looking first of all at the Chartists and Marx and Engels and their contribution, their thoughts on elections and how communists, Marxists should engage with them. Hope to see you then. Thank you all.
Thank
Good
you,
night.
everyone. Thank you. Take care.